Awesome. All right. So the topic of today's conversation is gathering scientific data, and we're lucky to be joined by coastal hazard experts Dr. Hannah Baranes and Connor Brooks from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's Climate Center. We also have a few other folks from our Climate Center on the team. We have Steph Sun joining, who's also going to be helping to monitor the chat. And we have Gail Bonus and Morgan Glenn, who are also in our Climate Center joining along. So in addition to all of our experts, all of you are joining as experts from your own community. So we have a number of middle and high school classes on the call, as well as a bunch of individuals from up and down the coast of Maine. And so at the end, I'll give us all a chance to turn on our cameras and wave hi to each other. All right, so today's plan, we're going to start with a quick introduction of the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, some upcoming events and how you can get involved, and then I'll pass it over to Hannah and Connor and open up the rest of our time to Q&A, and then go over a few next steps. So again, just drop your comments and questions into the chat and we'll read them out to our presenters. So just to start, the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project is a community or citizen science project that asks folks to take photos and make observations in their community. And the goals of this project are to gather local data, increase community engagement and awareness of flood vulnerabilities, and inform local and regional decision making. So many of us, especially those of us in Maine, recently experienced the impacts of coastal flooding and are in the midst of recovering from these storms. So it's our goal that participants in this community science project experience a sense of purpose, empowerment, and connection to their community. So it's really exciting to see that folks are joining from all over the region, as we all dropped into the chat. This map that I have pulled up here shows some places that are already involved in the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project. So these communities have established monitoring sites where we have or expect to gather observations of coastal flooding. But that being said, we need help from everyone along the coastline. So you can choose from a site in one of these pinned communities or make observations somewhere else. And all these observations, whether you see flooding or not, are super important and necessary for understanding our changing coastline, which Hannah and Connor will get into in a little bit. So some of our plans for this month, we're meeting today to get some background on the importance of collecting scientific data and get energized to then go out and make our own observations. So the highest predicted tides of the month are from February 8th through 12th. Those times vary based on your location, but those are the key days that we want you to go outside and make observations of your coastline. So I encourage you all to go out if conditions are safe. Do not wait in the water. Do not go out during extreme storms, but bring your friends, family, neighbors, classmates, and make observations, have conversations, submit your data to the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project. On those days, we also have a few partners and participating communities who are hosting coastal meetups during this time. So they're gathering a group of people to come together, and we will give some details following this meeting about where those are, what times, and how you can get involved. So following all of those high tide dates, we'll join together as the same group on February 15th at 1 p.m. to discuss what you have observed in your own community, and hope to connect up and down the coast. So the scientists will be back on the call, sharing what they've observed, and then we can all connect and share our own experience along the coastline. So just a few things, I'll send up a follow-up email with the dates and times of the high tides, a link to our coastal flooding community science project page that includes some additional details and information on data collection. And then I'll send a list of local meetups that are happening over that period of time with people you can contact for those. So for the Q&A, we will be prioritizing questions that go straight to our scientists. So any logistic questions, I can follow up with you. So with that, I'm going to send it over to our wonderful scientists, Hannah and Connor.
All right. Hi, everyone. Just finished getting everything shared. Okay. Abigail, does that look good? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Connor Brooks. I'm a young scientist here at GMRI, and I'm working on understanding and mapping flood risk and managing sea level rise. I just recently graduated college from Wisconsin, and I'm out here working with Hannah on making sure that this information is known and available to decision makers and to the public. Hannah, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everybody, and also thanks so much for your time and being here today. I'm Hannah Baranes. I'm a less young coastal scientist. I lead the coastal hazards group at Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and yeah, really turn it over to Connor to tell you a bit more about what we're doing, what you're doing, and why it's so important.
Yeah, so I just threw some pictures up on the slide here of some of the projects that we're working on here in the Climate Center, whether that's installing tide gauges, which are devices that measure water level, mapping flood risk and impacts, or working with towns to identify their unique risks. And one more thing just before we jump in here is I want to recognize that talking about flooding and sea level rise and climate change can be kind of a heavy topic. And in addition to feeling that, sense of frustration and sadness, I want to share a second viewpoint for thinking about climate change that I've developed through our work here. And that is that addressing climate change at the local level, doing what we're doing here today, really opens the door to opportunities to make decisions that will help our coastal communities thrive far into the future. So whether that's building a strong and prepared waterfront workforce, or clean water and air, or building healthy coastal ecosystems. But I'm sure top of everybody's mind recently is the really strong storms that swept through Maine's coast earlier this month. And I just want to share a few photos that I took from around Portland here, because I thought it really highlights kind of the challenge at hand. And that is, it's not really easy to predict exactly what will happen during these extreme flooding events. In some places, the city was really well prepared for flooding. They staged crews and closed roads early on. Portland's a big city and they've been through minor flooding before. But as we know, this was quite a bit worse of an event than we're used to. So paired with some snow melt that occurred during these days, there were a few surprises that popped up. And so some brave city workers and firefighters had to trudge through water to close roads and turn off power lines. And I'm sure your communities are also filled with similar stories of leadership and action during these really extreme events. And now our goal here is to make it so that these folks don't have to get wet when we know that high tides are coming. Now, luckily for us, the National Weather Service already publishes flood forecasts, which you can think of like weather forecasts except for water level. So how high will the high tides reach in the next few days? But it can be difficult for communities to really decipher what the exact impacts of flooding may be. So which roads will get wet and need to close, or where could there be a concern about waves splashing over? So in other words, it's hard for towns to take just a forecasted water level and translate that into the real world impacts of how to manage flooding. And this is where you all come in. So with your help, we'll be able to document how these extreme events impact our coast and communities. And with this knowledge, we're working towards building a network of understanding and predicting future high tides. So I just want to point out this photo here at the bottom. And it shows a road near the coast. You can see the ocean there in the background and a very crisp line of seaweed. So this is a high water mark from one of the recent storms. And what we know now is if we have the water level that water reached during the storms, we can pair it to what the impacts are. So if, we forecast a similar water level, we can say on this road, water is going to be lapping up at the edge. And, it's probably not safe for cars to drive through this road if there's waves splashing over and ocean water washing over the roads.
Also, shout out to Bree, who I saw sign on to this call. This is her photo from Tremont, so you all are already making great contributions.
And so using your photo and data submissions, the National Weather Service can then turn around and learn more about how extreme tides affect more areas along the coast and tidal rivers. So that means they'll be able to issue more detailed forecasts, and our towns will know more about those forecasts and how to prepare for high water, whether that's closing roads in advance or sandbaking buildings or alerting houses and communities that may be cut off. And the challenging part of this conversation is that extreme water levels will happen again, and they'll start to happen more frequently as sea levels rise. So here on the slide, I put an XY graph that shows sea level change from the year 1900 projected out past the year 2100. This black line here at the bottom, it shows the observed change in sea level that we've measured here in Portland. Notice how over the past 100 years, it starts to creep up a little. Well, it's climbed 7.5 inches in the past 100 years. So these big storms that have swept through earlier in January or in 2022, they've happened under less than a foot of sea level rise. Now, on the other edge of this graph, moving into the future, is the range of sea level rise that we can expect in the future, given the scenario that Maine has chosen to plan for. Now, it's a range because we don't know exactly how much sea levels will rise, because we don't know how human behaviors around greenhouse gas emissions, like how much fuel we burn, will change in the future. But we are confident that sea levels will continue to rise and that the rate of sea level rise is increasing. So this blue area is not a straight line. Notice how it curves upwards. Now, our state government has already committed to be ready for 1.5 feet of sea level rise in the next 25 years and 4 feet by the year 2100. Now, I know this is a very brief overview of a complex problem, and we're happy to answer more questions about it in just a few minutes. And when we think of adapting to sea level rise here in Maine specifically, we can already think of ourselves as being a little bit more resilient than other places facing this challenge because of our really large tide range. So that means we're able to recover and adapt from these events. Here's 2 pictures that I took right outside the doors here at GMRI at some of the wharves in Portland. And notice how we already design our waterfronts to handle daily sea level change of around 10 feet. And that's in Portland. Up in Lubec and Eastport, the tide range is 20 feet. Your wharves are twice as tall as this. We know what goes into building durable waterfronts that can withstand the tide that we're already used to. So now, as we look forward and repair and rebuild from these past storms, we'll have to take into account sea level rise, and with that, adapt to the coming higher tides.
So Connor just gave a really great overview of how the specific work you all will be doing is going to translate to the helping solve the problem of managing coastal flooding in your communities. But I also wanted to take a step back and look at how the work you're doing fits into the broader challenge of adapting to sea level rise. And I think one of the most important sets of ideas out there in terms of thinking kind of like what the big picture of adaptation looks like comes from Kelsey Leonard, who's an Indigenous scientist and scholar from the Shinnecock Nation. And she, in part of her whole kind of set of ideas for addressing sea level rise, she talks about 2 key important parts. So one is witnessing, or essentially taking notice and observing changes in your own community. And uniting, or coming together across communities to build capacity or the ability to adapt. You flip the slide forward. Thanks. And that's exactly what you all are doing through this project. So in terms of witnessing, you all are observing and acknowledging changes in your own communities. And then in terms of uniting, I'm very excited for the moment that we all turn our videos on and get to see each other. So we are uniting across towns in Maine, we're uniting across generations or ages, and we're uniting across roles within the community. So there are, as a part of this project, there are students, teachers, forecasters, local decision makers, scientists. We're all here working on this together. So thank you all so much for being a part of it.
Thanks so much, Connor and Hannah. What a great and thorough presentation. So as we get into the Q&A part, as you think of questions, you can drop them into the chat. I'll just go over quickly some next steps while we're waiting for some questions to come in. So where are we going from here? So to start, we want everyone to go out and make observations and join local coastal meetups, grab a group of peers, head out during the high tides to take photos and upload them to the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, and then have discussions with friends, family, classmates, neighbors about what you experienced, whether by joining us, by joining this group again, or just going out into your community. We're hosting a similar series of events for March and April. I can talk about that a little bit more towards the end, but I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. So feel free to drop questions. I will start off with a question for Connor and Hannah. I'm interested in what questions you've been asking lately or how these recent storms have started to change your thinking.
Are we sharing the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna stop our share. Cool. Just to check, we're not sharing screen and y'all can hear us okay? Okay, awesome. So the question was how these recent storms have maybe changed our thinking. I'd say really the most important thing is that Connor made the great point that sea level so far has risen 7.5 inches, and just with that 7.5 inches of sea level rise in the last, since 2018, we've seen much more frequent extreme coastal flooding events with storms in 2018, 2020, then again last December, and then the 2 events this January. And what should stand out there is that 7.5 inches is smaller than the numbers that Maine has committed to managing over the rest of this century. So 1.5 feet in 2050 and 4 feet in 2100. And that to me is just sort of these recent storms give us kind of a benchmark for what the new severe event looks like. And it's kind of raised the important questions of if we're recovering from these storms, how do we rebuild? How high, how strong? And maybe even in some cases, do we rebuild at all?
Great, thanks. Any questions from those online?
Yeah, we got one in a direct message. You want to read it and answer it?
Yeah, so our question was, how do we like our job? Is our job fun? So like I said earlier, we deal with some pretty challenging topics that, can lead to some uncomfortable conversations, but, we've really tried to adopt this lens of we're helping communities prepare for, to thrive and far into the future and be ready for the changes that are going to come. Change has been a constant for living on the coast, and it's just considerations that we'll have to take moving forward. And I think that it's really rewarding to, come together with communities and different groups from across all ages to kind of work on these really tough problems. So as much as there are, some uncomfortable truths that we have to deal with, I think that it's overall like a really rewarding aspect of working on the coast and working on climate change.
And maybe I'll just add also, it's working in Maine has been a particularly sort of inspirational and important experience for me because like after these storms, for example, I'm sure like your communities are experiencing some really devastating loss. And even in these really hard moments, I hear the conversation like turning to recognizing the realities of climate change and thinking about, okay, this is happening. How do we rebuild stronger and make decisions that will keep us resilient into the future? And that's just such an important and strong viewpoint to have that I've seen from our coastal communities.
We had another question come in on why did we pick students to help with this project? And I think that working with students is always a really rewarding experience. And part of that is, this is, your communities too. These are the communities that you'll grow up in and you'll see change happen over the coming years. And it really gives you a stake of, contributing data and submissions that help improve and manage flooding in your own communities.
I would also, that's great. And I would also say, in my experience, like when, what you all say is more listened to and important than anything that like scientists say, because it's your future and it's your communities, and grown-up decision makers really hear that perspective.
We had a few more questions coming in from King Middle. So they're interested in how or why did you start the data collection?
Yeah, so kind of what we talked on earlier, in that it's hard for communities to kind of decipher what these flood forecasts mean for each community. I think Maine has something like 140, 150 coastal communities, and the forecasts are really only published for areas where we have long-term tide gauges. Those are those devices that measure water level on really short timeframes, every 6 minutes for 100-year records. So we have really good understanding of tides at a few places, but we want to build out our understanding of the impacts of flooding across a lot of different communities. And so collecting this data from people who live in these communities and can see what the impacts are, and have community knowledge that they've built up about how floodwaters affect them is really useful. And we're trying to consolidate that information so that National Weather Service and other scientists can help translate that data for decision makers to move forward in an adaptive way.
We had a few other questions coming in about evacuation plans. So are there let me find them. What kind of evacuation plans do you have? When would evacuation be necessary during floods and storms? Where would people go? What would we do? Any ideas?
Okay. Thanks for the question. So because our coastline is relatively steep, meaning if you start at the water and you start to walk away from the water, you tend to go uphill pretty fast. When water comes in during storms, it's generally not huge areas that get inundated or covered by a lot of water. And so the concern we have is less about evacuating people from the areas that get flooded and more that when water comes in, it can block certain roadways that people like for a few hours that people might need to take to get to a hospital or like for the school bus to get to school. And so more than kind of like evacuating people out of specific areas, we look at like where are the key points in a community where if water covers a road for a while, it will cause a lot of disruption. And that's something that it's been really heartening to see a lot of different communities take a close look at and use that information to prioritize or kind of decide what order to work in for example, raising roads or building bridges higher.
Great. We had a question. What's the highest tide that has been in Portland? And on top of that, how high do you predict it could get in, let's say, 10 years?
So the highest tide that's been measured in Portland, and I say measured because we only have 100 years of record, that was the tide that actually occurred just recently on January 13th, and we reached a little over 14.5 feet. The prior highest tide before the January storms was during the blizzard of 1978, which was, I think, right around 14 feet, maybe a little above that, but our January storm topped that level, and the storm on the Wednesday came close. I think it was the third highest water level that we've seen in Portland. And then you want to answer how high we can expect to be in 10 years?
Sure, yeah. So that's a really great question and a little bit of a challenging one to answer because we don't necessarily know what sea level is going to do for the next 10 years. So if sea level kept rising at the current rate that it was rising, so Connor talked about how when you look into the future, that sea level rise curve gets like steeper and steeper and steeper. then sea level would rise maybe another like quarter foot or so in the next 10 years. And then if we had an absolute worst case scenario of like the highest possible tide combining with, the highest possible storm surge, we could go, maybe another half a foot higher. So I'd say, my best ballpark answer is in the next 10 years, maybe about a foot higher. One thing that is sort of important to know, I think, about the types of flooding events that we get where we live in Maine, is that, if you live in Florida or Texas or New York, like anywhere that's farther south and outside the Gulf of Maine, those floods are usually caused by hurricanes. And hurricanes are a type of storm that are really intense and come through really fast and can cause really, really high water levels. So maybe you think you've seen the worst flood event you'd ever see, and then like all of a sudden there's an event that's like a flood that's way higher than anything you've ever seen. We don't get those kinds of storms causing most of our flooding here. So there's not some possibility of a superstorm that we haven't seen yet, that we know of, that is suddenly gonna raise water levels an extra 10 feet higher than anything we've ever seen, for example. Which is what happened if you all might be some folks on this call might be too young to remember Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, but that's kind of what happened with those hurricanes in the past.
Could you just add some context as to what a typical tide might be?
Yeah, so the typical tides range across the coast of Maine. We have some of the highest tides of the world in the Gulf of Maine. And so down here in Portland, way in the southern part of the state, our tides range about 10 feet twice a day, every day. And that varies over the course of a month and also on longer scales of years. So sometimes it might rise and fall 8 feet, sometimes it might rise and fall 11 feet, but around 10 feet is pretty average. And then as you go down east, towards Lubec and Eastport, they have some really high tides as you kind of work your way up into the Bay of Fundy, and their tides rise and fall upwards of 20 feet every day, twice a day. And again, those also vary on the month scale, so that's how you have spring and neap tides, and then on scales longer than that too. And that's mostly just due to the Earth and the Moon and the Sun and how they're rotating around each other in space.
Thanks. All right, we have a question from Washington Academy. They're curious with how marine organisms may be affected by sea level rise.
Let me think about that one for a moment. I don't know. I have never read anything about impacts of sea level rise to marine organisms. Oh, you know what? Actually, there is one thing that is important to mention. So a lot of marine organisms, like sort of in the younger parts of their life cycles, they live in intertidal habitats like salt marshes or mud flats. So those are habitats. Intertidal means that sometimes they're dry at low tides and sometimes they're wet at higher tides. And when sea level rises, those sorts of habitats start becoming wet more of the time or underwater more of the time. And that's not something that those specific organisms are adapted to handle. So when you might hear conversations about, well, like, how will mud flats evolve as sea level rises? Will they still be around? Will salt marshes survive as sea level rises? That's all about, like, those types of environments need to be wet a certain amount of time, they need to be dry a certain amount of time. And that's something that's changing.
Right, I have two questions about your jobs in particular. So first is simply, how do you do your job? What do you need to do your job? And the other is, what is it like knowing that you're someone working on a major movement?
Yeah, so in terms of just like our day-to-day job and how we do it, it certainly changes from day to day. I mean, some days are very, we just spend it on the computer, whether that's, analyzing and looking at some of the tide data and some of the projections for sea level rise. And some days we are out doing field work, so we're installing those tide gauges. And so that's again, those tide gauges are those devices that measure what water level is in a few communities. So some communities on the call might be familiar with a new tide gauge that went up in your city in the past few months in the fall. And then there's a lot of meetings that we have with community members too. So, we really do a lot of different things from day to day, and it definitely keeps us on our feet. But it's, like I said earlier, it's rewarding work to be able to work on several different projects that kind of works somewhat more on the science side of things and really measuring and predicting water level, and then also working with communities and building out our adaptation strategies and helping communities understand how to prepare for the future. And then can you ask the second part of that question again, Abigail?
So the second part was, what's it like knowing that you're someone working on like a major flood movement, a major topic like sea level rise?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take just adding to all the great things Connor said about what we need to do our jobs. One additional thing for me, I think, is like great engagement from people like you who ask questions that make us think about things we haven't thought of before, and a great team. So for example, it's really special for me to get to work with Connor and Abigail and Steph, who like ask great questions and constantly push me to think about problems in new ways, hopefully similar to the way that you do in your classroom sometime. So that never changes as you start a job. And what does it feel like to be part of a movement? Oh my gosh. I guess especially with these recent flood events, it's almost felt like we've gotten to have this megaphone to share a message at a time when people are listening. And I think mostly I just feel like really thankful that we have that megaphone, and that that people have done so much hard work that make us ready to speak into it. I don't have anything to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Hannah said. I'd say, like, we mentioned in the presentation, it's pretty heavy work, and there's sometimes a lot of challenging conversations that come out of it, especially like looking towards future projections of flooding in communities and things like that. But it's rewarding to work with communities who are really invested in adapting and moving through this together. So it's really heartening to see kind of both sides of that, I'd say.
All right, I have two more questions. So the first one is, who makes the decisions about how to react or adapt to rising sea levels?
Yeah, so that could look different in many different communities. We have, very big range of communities on the call today, ranging from the biggest city in Maine, Portland, which has, whole emergency management department that is sometimes, dozens of people who in working on closing and alerting people flooding, all the way to really small towns that it's just a town or a few a community involved community members who kind of working on building out this understanding and helping prepare their communities. So it really ranges depending on where you are in the state. And then there's also input from both the county level in Maine, from county level emergency managers, and the state level as well. So Department of Transportation is really active in monitoring roadways, and the state government is working on some initiatives to make this whole process go a little bit easier for communities who are rising up to the challenge.
Yeah, that's great. And the only thing I'd add is that there's no one way to respond to this problem, and the best solution, or kind of the whole hodgepodge of best solutions, looks different in every community, and we're all kind of learning together. And so the kind of one of the really important decision makers, I would add, is you as a person who lives in the community you live in. And as part of this project later on, students will have opportunities to kind of share some of those opinions with decision makers in your communities, and those voices will be heard and they will be important.
Well, you basically answered the next question I was going to ask, which was, how can we help? Any more to add to that?
Talk to your neighbors, talk to your families, talk to your friends. Yeah, the more conversations you can have about what you're seeing and why it's important, the more we'll be able to like build capacity or build the ability to take collective action or action together. And so the more people you involve in what you're thinking about and what you're seeing, the more powerful our actions can be.
Great. All right, well, I'm gonna wrap us up here. But if you had questions that we didn't get to, I'll make sure to write them down and follow up with all of you. So again, we are hosting similar events for the months of March and April, and I'll send out more information about that. But thanks all for joining us today. I hope you get to get outside and go observe the high tides from February 8th to 12th, and then join us back again on February 15th. So I'm looking forward to seeing all your observations and for that conversation. So I'm going to stop recording.